Welcome to Dark Stories for Scary Kids. This week's episode, The Flags. Enjoy. Once upon a time, there was a girl who loved the sea. It was her neighbor, and every morning she would wake up as the sun rose, put on her wetsuit and walk the long, steep track next to her house, down the cliffside to the beach below. She would breathe in the sea air, then step into the water and surf until the afternoon. For her age, no one could dispute that she was the best at what she did. She could take any wave of any size and ride and tame them until they made the shore. But to her, the beach was becoming too easy, and though it was home, it was becoming boring fast. So fast, she was convinced she had seen every kind of wave there was. She would go to the lifeguards who watched over the beach and ask them, "Can I surf outside of the flags, in the rougher waters?" But they would always say no, saying, "You're not old enough for those waves. Keep training between the flags and one day you will be experienced enough to surf the rough waters." At night, the girl would lay in bed and stew in her anger. She knew she could surf outside the flags, if only they would let her try. But soon enough, sleep came, and she was plunged into a nocturnal abyss, not too dissimilar to the depths of the waters below the surf. She would dream of rough waters, waves as tall as skyscrapers crashing violently into the cliff sides. She would take her board and swim out into the wild, open, infinite waters. She was brave, and she rode the tall waves easily. But as she flew through the air, freed by her dream, she saw a surfboard below her. It pristine and new, much better than her old father's one she was forced to use. She watched it floating away into the places where the water was darkest. The area looked rough, so she, the best surfer there ever was, decided to paddle her way out. As she floated, looking around her to the lone board ahead, she noticed a shimmer under the water, something deep below jolting to life at her presence. The water became rough, slowly but steadily, each wave pushing her closer and closer to the rocks below. She tried to paddle away, to get herself free of the rip. She looked down to the murky shapes below once more, catching a glimpse of long, white, outstretched arms reaching up in the moonlight from the sand below. A voice came from the deep. "Come to me," beckoning her down from below. She woke up. That morning, she woke up and laughed off her dreams. She jumped out of bed, put on her wetsuit and grabbed her father's board, making her way down the cliffsides to the beach once more. But something was off that day. The sky was cold and grey, the beach empty, and the surf angry. Seeing the challenging conditions ahead, still, she got into the water. She took to the surf, and even though the waves were strong, she was stronger, and rode them with ease. The water was cold and filled with seaweed, but she did not care. She was high on victory and loved each chilling rush. The kelp brushed against her legs in the sandy mist below. After a time, she rested in the shallow, calmer waters. As she caught her breath, she looked up and towards the beach. The lifeguard's chair lay empty, not a soul in sight. She looked to the rough waters beside her down the beachhead, to the water outside the flags. She struggled with herself for a few moments, trying to think rationally, but the rush came over her. Now was the time. She started to wade past the flags, into the churning sea ahead. She paddled out to the deeper waters and waited for the waves to come, and they did, mountains of white foam and brine towering over her. She managed to catch a few, but soon found herself tossed to the seabed as they flew over her. Determined and angry, she paddled to the back once more when the next wave of the series came. It was slow to build, but once it had made its peak, it was massive. A wall of brown, misty sand streaked with black veins of seaweed towering over her. She mounted the board and tried to catch it before it came crashing down on her. sending her to the depths and her board snatched from her grasp. She shivered under the dark waves, trying to find her way up through the chaos, each direction only showing more seaweed, more blinding sand. Above her she saw a light, the sun breaking through the murk. She swam to it and broke out into the air. She searched for the beach and saw it ahead. She was within swimming distance. She began to paddle towards the sand when she remembered her father's board. She looked around for it, wiping the sand and salt from her eyes when she saw it behind her, the lone board bobbing up and down in the distant waves, getting closer and closer to an outcropping of rocks. She stared at it, then to the beach. In the anger of her failure, and in her determination to prove herself once more as the best surfer to grace that beach, she turned her back on the shore and began to swim for the board. The water slowly turned darker. Sharp, jagged rocks below cloaked in churning kelp. She swam on, the board seeming to get closer and closer to the distant rocks. She paddled harder, gaining speed in the water as it began to grow more violent. Her gut screamed at her to turn back, but she would not. She was the best surfer to grace that beach, and she would not lose her board. As the water turned more manic, it also became more foul, home to dead fish and endless locks of rotting seaweed and coral. Ahead, she saw the rocks, the waves crashing against them in giant white explosions of foam. Slowly, the surf pulled her towards them. She tried to turn back, but it was too late. Ahead of her, her board disappeared below, the water rushing into a flooding, half-submerged cave, its entrance a small crack in the rocks. She tried to swim away, but it was too late. She was stuck in the water's grip, and as it rushed into the crack, it pulled her in also, her disappearing into the dark. The sea spat her out onto a small sandbank near the cave's entrance, scraping her knee in the process. She sat up on the wet sand, feeling the cold before tending to her knee, the salt burning it as her blood dripped into the water. She began to cry as she looked around her, her new home a small, tight cavern filled with jagged rock and long, rotted seaweed, the entrance, now above her, providing the only light to see with. She looked for her board, but it was nowhere to be found. Her blood dripped into the water, forming red, spindly snakes that arced into the darkness ahead where the water ran. She tried to contain herself when ahead, from the darkness, she heard a voice. "Is this yours, dear?" She covered her eyes. Surely she was in a dream, and that she was home in bed, her dog at her feet and her parents next door. "Are you lost, dear?" It said again. The girl yelled, calling for her parents to rescue her, but it was too late. She opened her eyes. Ahead of her, reaching out from the darkness, two long, rotted white arms grabbed her, wrapping around her like a snake as their owner flew forwards toward her. Corpse, its head small with eyes melted out and blue splintered lips. Its torso skin a spoiled white cloth wrapped tightly around its starved and rotted frame. Its arms covered her as she came face to face with the thing. She screamed as it opened its mouth, carrying her into the dark waters. "I am starved of air. Give me a sip of your lungs, as your breath is like wine." She tried to scream and fight it, but it was too late, it carrying her below the murky, churning waters into the silent darkness below. A search was made, but no one ever found the girl. Not a scrap of her soul to be found on the beaches or in the waves. It is rumored that one day a boy saw a board floating near the rough waters, but it was likely just a dream. All that is known is that on the darkest nights, if you stand on that beach, you may feel a rogue gust of wind and hear an echoing call, a begging plea to all those that listen. Return, return between the flags.